The wind off the mountains didn't just bite, it punished. It came down through the narrow gaps between buildings like something with teeth, scraping across exposed skin, turning breath into visible ghosts that hung in the air for half a second before vanishing. The town of Coldwater Ridge wasn't built for comfort. It was built for extraction, timber, ore, pelts, whatever the wilderness would give up if you were willing to bleed for it. The buildings leaned into each other like drunks, their wood warped and blackened by weather and wood smoke. Nothing here was permanent except the cold. Mara Vance had been cold for so long she'd almost forgotten what warmth felt like. She moved quickly through the back streets, her boots crunching on the ice-crusted mud, her thin coat pulled tight around her shoulders. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. But it was what she had. Same as the worn dress underneath, the same dress she'd been wearing for 3 weeks because Mrs. Pritchard only provided one set of work clothes and expected it to last the season. Mrs. Pritchard. The name alone made Mara's jaw tighten. The boarding house where she worked sat on the eastern edge of town, a squat 2-story structure that smelled like boiled cabbage and kerosene. Mara had been there for 8 months. Ever since the wagon train she'd come west with had dissolved in a mess of broken axles, cholera, and bad decisions. She'd had $12 to her name and nowhere to go. Mrs. Pritchard had offered her a job, kitchen work, laundry, chamber pots, anything that needed doing. $5 a month, room and board included. Except the room was a closet under the stairs that barely fit a cot, and the board was whatever scraps were left after the paying guests had eaten. Mara had learned quickly that Mrs. Pritchard's generosity had limits, and those limits were drawn in her favor, always. Tonight, Mara had been sent to Brennan's general store to pick up a shipment of lye soap that Mrs. Pritchard had ordered a week ago and refused to pay delivery for. "You've got legs, don't you?" she'd said, not looking up from her ledger. "Then use them." So Mara had walked the 6 blocks in the freezing dark, collected the package, and started back. She should have taken the main road. She knew that. But the main road added another 10 minutes to the walk, and her fingers were already numb inside her threadbare gloves. The alley behind the saloon cut the distance in half. It was a mistake. She realized it the moment she turned the corner and saw them. 6 men, clustered near the back door of the Silver Pine Saloon, passing a bottle between them. They were loud, laughing, shoving each other, their voices sharp and aggressive in the way men got when they'd been drinking just long enough to feel bulletproof. Mara recognized a few of them. Loggers, mostly. The kind of men who worked brutal hours in the forest and came into town every few weeks to spend their pay on whiskey and women and whatever else would help them forget the trees. She could have turned around. Should have, but one of them had already seen her. "Well, well," he said, his voice cutting through the group like a knife. "Look what we got here." The others turned. Mara kept walking, her eyes down, her grip tightening on the package in her arms. If she didn't engage, if she just kept moving... "Hey, I'm talking to you." She didn't stop. A hand shot out and grabbed her arm, yanking her sideways. The package tumbled from her grip, hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud. Mara stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her heart slamming in her chest. "Let go," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man holding her was big, broad-shouldered, with a patchy beard and eyes that were just a little too bright. He smelled like sweat and whiskey and something sour she couldn't name. "You're that girl," he said, squinting at her. "The one working for Pritchard." "Let go," Mara said again. He didn't. Instead, he grinned, showing teeth that were more brown than white. "You know, we were just talking about you the other day, me and the boys. Weren't we, Cleet?" One of the others, a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, laughed. "Sure were. Saying how Pritchard works you like a mule and pays you nothing. That don't seem fair, does it?" "Doesn't seem fair at all," the first man agreed. He still hadn't let go of her arm. "Maybe we could help you out. Give you a little extra income, you know. All you gotta do is be friendly." Mara jerked her arm, trying to pull free, but his grip tightened. "I said let go." "Easy now." His grin widened. "No need to be rude. We're just trying to have a conversation." The other men had started to circle around her now, closing off the alley. Mara's pulse hammered in her ears. She'd been in bad situations before. Every woman who traveled west had. But this felt different. Worse. These men weren't looking at her like she was a person. They were looking at her like she was nothing. "I don't want any trouble," Mara said, hating the way her voice shook. "Then don't make any." The man leaned in closer, his breath hot against her face. Just come upstairs with us for a bit. Have a drink. Relax. No. His expression darkened. No? She said no, Vern, one of the other men said, though he didn't sound particularly invested in backing her up. Maybe we should just… Shut up, Harley. Vern's eyes never left Mara's face. She don't get to say no. Not to me. Mara's stomach twisted. She looked past him, toward the mouth of the alley, but it was too far. Even if she ran, they'd catch her before she made it halfway. And if she screamed, who would come? This wasn't the kind of town where people rushed to help. This was the kind of town where people looked the other way. Please, she said, and hated herself for it. Vern laughed. It was a low, ugly sound. Please, I like that. Say it again. She didn't. His hand moved from her arm to her shoulder, then lower. Mara twisted away, her back hitting the wall, her breathing fast and shallow. The other men were closing in now, their faces blurred by the dark and her own rising panic. She was going to have to fight. She was going to lose. And no one was going to… Step back. The voice came from the far end of the alley, low and even, like someone commenting on the weather. Every head turned. A man stood there, just outside the circle of lamplight spilling from the saloon's back window. He was tall, taller than any of them, and built like something carved out of the mountains themselves. Broad shoulders, long arms, a heavy coat that made him look even bigger. His face was shadowed, but Mara could see the dark line of a beard, the glint of eyes that didn't blink. "The hell do you want?" Vern snapped, though he didn't let go of Mara. The man didn't answer right away. He just walked forward, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching on the ice. When he stepped into the light, Mara saw him clearly for the first time. He was older than her, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by wind and time. His hair was long, tied back, streaked with gray. He didn't look angry. He didn't look anything. He just looked steady. "I said step back," he repeated. Vern laughed, but it sounded forced. "You got no business here, old man. I'm making it my business." "Yeah? You and what army?" The man stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even raise his hands. He just stood there, looking at Vern like he was waiting for him to figure something out. "Let her go," he said quietly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Vern shoved Mara aside, hard enough that she stumbled, catching herself against the wall again. "You want her? Fine. Take her. She's not worth the trouble anyway." He turned to leave, but the man shifted, blocking his path. Vern stopped. "Move." "Not yet." "You deaf? I said move." The man didn't move. He just looked at Vern, and something passed between them, something Mara didn't understand but could feel. It was in the way Vern's jaw tightened, the way his hands balled into fists. "You think you're tough?" Vern said, his voice rising. "You think you can just walk in here and…" "I think you're going to walk away," the man said. "Right now, before this gets worse for you." "Worse for me?" Vern barked a laugh. "There's 6 of us and 1 of you." "I know." The simplicity of it seemed to throw Vern off. He glanced at the others, looking for support, but none of them moved. They were watching the stranger, and Mara could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. This wasn't some drunk they could push around. This was something else. "Come on, Vern," one of them finally said. "Let's just go." "Shut up." But the moment had passed. Mara could feel it. Whatever violence had been coiling in the air was starting to unwind, not because the danger was gone, but because Vern had lost control of it. He knew it too. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, the way his eyes flicked away from the stranger's face. "This isn't over," Vern said, his voice tight. "Yes, it is," the man replied. Vern spat on the ground, glaring, but he stepped aside. The others followed, moving past the man in a loose group, muttering to each other. Vern was the last to go. He paused at the mouth of the alley, looking back at Mara with something cold and mean in his eyes. "See you around," he said. Then they were gone. Mara stood there, her back still pressed against the wall, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The man turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. He nodded, then bent down and picked up the package she'd dropped, brushing the dirt off before handing it to her. "You should take the main road next time." Mara took the package, her hands trembling. Thank you. He didn't answer, just gave a small nod and started to walk away. Wait, she called after him. He stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. Who are you? He looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he said, Elias Crow. I know who you are. His voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. Everyone knows who you are. You're the girl who works for Pritchard. The way he said it, like it was just a fact, not a judgment, made something tighten in her chest. Get home safe, he said. And then he turned and walked into the dark. Mara stood there for a long time, watching the place where he'd disappeared, her heart still hammering, her mind racing. She didn't know what had just happened, didn't know why he'd helped her, or what it meant, or what would come next. But she knew one thing. Vern had said it wasn't over, and she believed him. The walk back to the boarding house felt longer than it should have. Mara kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see Vern and his friends following her, but the streets were empty. Just the wind and the dark and the distant sound of the saloon piano drifting through the frozen air. When she finally pushed through the back door of the boarding house, Mrs. Pritchard was waiting. Took you long enough, the woman said without looking up from the pot she was stirring on the stove. She was a hard, angular woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and a mouth that seemed permanently set in disapproval. Brennan give you any trouble? No, ma'am. Good. Put the soap in the pantry and get upstairs. The guests will be wanting their supper soon, and I need you to set the table. Mara nodded, setting the package down and moving toward the narrow staircase that led to the main floor. Her hands were still shaking. She tried to hide it, but Mrs. Pritchard saw everything. What's wrong with you? The woman asked sharply. Nothing. Don't lie to me, girl. You look like you've seen a ghost. Mara hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell Mrs. Pritchard what had happened, wanted someone, anyone, to know. But the harder, smarter part of her knew better. Mrs. Pritchard didn't care about her problems. She cared about her work getting done. I'm fine, Mara said. Just cold. Mrs. Pritchard snorted. Then move faster. Heat yourself up. Mara went upstairs. The dining room was small and dim, lit by a single oil lamp hanging over a long wooden table. There were 8 chairs, though only 5 were currently occupied by guests. Mara moved quietly, setting out plates and utensils, trying not to draw attention to herself. It didn't work. There she is, one of the men said, a fat merchant named Doyle, who'd been staying at the house for the past week. Our little ghost, the others laughed. Mara kept her head down, focusing on the table. You ever going to talk to us, girl? Doyle pressed. Or are you too good for conversation? Leave her alone, Doyle, another guest said, an older man with kind eyes. She's just doing her job. I'm just being friendly. You're being a pest. Doyle grumbled something under his breath but let it drop. Mara finished setting the table and retreated to the kitchen where Mrs. Pritchard was ladling stew into bowls. Take these out, the woman said, shoving 2 bowls into Mara's hands. And don't spill. Mara carried them carefully back to the dining room, setting them in front of the guests. She made 3 more trips, bringing out the rest of the food, and then stood by the wall, waiting in case anyone needed anything. It was part of her job, to be present but invisible. To anticipate needs without being asked. She was good at it. She'd had to be. Doyle was still watching her, though, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. She'd dealt with men like him before. Men who thought that because she was poor and alone, she was available. Mrs. Pritchard didn't care, as long as they paid their rent. And Mara had learned that the best way to handle it was to pretend she didn't notice. But tonight, after what had happened in the alley, it was harder to ignore. Mara, Mrs. Pritchard called from the kitchen. Get in here. Mara slipped out of the dining room, grateful for the escape. Mrs. Pritchard was standing by the sink, her arms crossed, her expression sour. Brennan sent a note, she said, holding up a slip of paper. Says you shorted him on payment. Mara's stomach dropped. What? No, I gave him exactly what you told me to. He says it was $2 short. That's not possible. I counted it twice. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes narrowed. Are you calling him a liar? I'm saying there must be a mistake. The only mistake here is you. Mrs. Pritchard crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire. I'll have to go settle it myself tomorrow, and you can be damn sure I'll be taking it out of your wages. But I didn't. Enough. Mrs. Pritchard's voice was sharp as a slap. You've got dishes to do. Get to it. Mara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. There was no point. Mrs. Pritchard had already decided she was at fault, and nothing Mara said would change that. It was always like this. Every mistake, every problem, every inconvenience, it all came back to her. She turned to the sink and started scrubbing. But it was past midnight by the time Mara finished her work. The guests had gone to bed, Mrs. Pritchard had retired to her room, and the house had settled into the kind of creaking, restless silence that old buildings always had. Mara climbed the narrow stairs to her closet, every step a reminder of how bone-tired she was. The space barely deserved to be called a room. It was just a wedge of unused area beneath the staircase, fitted with a thin cot and a single shelf for her belongings. There was no window, no heat. In the winter, she could see her breath. In the summer, it was stifling, but it was hers. Or at least, it was the closest thing to hers she'd had in a long time. She sat down on the cot and pulled off her boots, wincing at the blisters on her heels. She should have asked Mrs. Pritchard for new ones weeks ago, but she knew what the answer would be. Make do. Everyone else does. Mara lay back, staring up at the underside of the stairs. She could hear the house settling around her, could hear Doyle snoring in the room above. Normally, she fell asleep fast. Exhaustion was a powerful sedative, but tonight her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking about the alley, about Vern's hand on her arm, the way his breath had smelled, the cold certainty that no one was coming to help. And then Elias Crow had appeared. She didn't know what to make of him, didn't know why he'd stepped in or what he'd wanted. Men didn't help women for free. That was something she'd learned early. There was always a price, always an expectation. But he hadn't asked for anything. He'd just left. Maybe he was different, or maybe he was just better at hiding what he wanted. Mara closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. She needed sleep. Tomorrow would be another long day, and Mrs. Pritchard wouldn't care if she was tired. She was just starting to drift off when she heard it. A sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps on the stairs above her. Mara's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone moving carefully, trying not to be heard. They stopped right above her. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a creak, the sound of weight shifting. Mara sat up slowly, her heart pounding. The footsteps moved again, this time away, back toward the guest rooms. She exhaled, trying to calm herself. It was probably nothing, just one of the guests getting up to use the privy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing right above her, listening. She didn't sleep much after that. Morning came too soon. Mara dragged herself out of bed and got to work, moving through the familiar routine on autopilot. Stoke the fire. Make the coffee. Start the porridge. Set the table. Smile. Stay invisible. The guests came down one by one, bleary-eyed and grumbling. Doyle was the last to arrive, and when he did, Mara noticed the way his eyes tracked her across the room. It wasn't subtle. "Sleep well?" he asked as she poured his coffee. "Fine, thank you." "Funny. I thought I heard something last night, like someone moving around." Mara's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second, but she forced herself to keep pouring. "Must have been the wind." "Must have been." He was smiling, but there was nothing friendly about it. Mara finished her task and retreated to the kitchen, her pulse racing. He'd been the one on the stairs, she was sure of it now. But why? What had he been doing? "Mara!" Mrs. Pritchard's voice cut through her thoughts. "Stop daydreaming and get the laundry started. We've got a full house this week, and I won't have dirty sheets piling up." "Yes, ma'am." Mara spent the rest of the morning hauling water, scrubbing linens, and hanging them to dry in the frigid air behind the house. Her hands were raw and red by the time she finished, her shoulders aching from the weight of the wet fabric. She was just coming back inside when she heard raised voices from the front of the house. "I don't care what she says," a man was shouting. "She owes me, and I mean to collect." Mara froze. It was Vern. She moved quietly toward the front room, staying out of sight. Through the doorway, she could see him standing in the entryway, his face flushed, his fists clenched. Mrs. Pritchard was facing him, her arms crossed, her expression stony. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Pritchard said coldly. "Your girl, the one who works here, she humiliated me last night." How exactly did she do that? She, Vern stopped, seeming to realize how it would sound. She got some mountain man to threaten me and my friends. Mrs. Pritchard's eyebrows rose. Did she now? I want her gone, fired, out of this town. You don't get to make demands in my house, Mr. Tully. I'm a paying customer at the Silver Pine. I bring business to this town, and I'm telling you, if she stays, there's going to be trouble. Mrs. Pritchard was silent for a long moment. Then she said, I'll handle it. Vern seemed satisfied with that. He left without another word. Mara's stomach turned to ice. She waited until she heard the front door close, then stepped into the hallway. Mrs. Pritchard was still standing there, her face unreadable. Ma'am, pack your things, Mrs. Pritchard said flatly. Mara's breath caught. What? You heard me. Pack your things and get out. But I didn't. I don't care what you did or didn't do. You're more trouble than you're worth. Mrs. Pritchard turned and walked toward the kitchen. You've got 1 hour. Where am I supposed to go? Mrs. Pritchard didn't answer. Mara stood there, frozen, as the reality of it sank in. She was being thrown out, again, and this time she had nowhere to run. She climbed the stairs to her closet, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't have much to pack, a change of clothes, a comb, a small sewing kit her mother had given her before she died. It all fit in a single cloth bag. When she came back downstairs, Mrs. Pritchard was waiting by the door. Your wages, the woman said, pressing a small envelope into Mara's hand. Minus what you owe for the soap incident, don't come back. Mara stepped out into the cold, the door slamming shut behind her. She stood there for a moment, clutching her bag, trying to figure out what to do next. The envelope felt light, too light. When she opened it, there were only $3 inside. $3. That was it. That was everything she had. Mara walked. She didn't know where she was going, just away. Away from the boarding house, away from Vern, away from all of it. The wind cut through her coat like it wasn't even there, and her feet ached with every step, but she kept moving. By the time the sun started to set, she found herself on the edge of town, near the livery. There was a small stable there, and behind it, a stack of hay bales covered with a tarp. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Mara crawled under the tarp and curled up in the hay, pulling her coat tight around her. This was her life now. This was what she'd become. She closed her eyes and tried not to cry. She woke to the sound of footsteps. Mara sat up, her heart pounding, her body stiff from the cold. It was still dark, early morning maybe, though she couldn't be sure. The footsteps were close, just on the other side of the hay bales. I know you're in there. The voice was low and familiar. Elias Crow. Mara didn't move. I'm not here to hurt you, he said. I'm here to offer you a choice. Slowly, Mara pushed the tarp aside and looked out. Elias was standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. How did you find me? She asked. Small town. People talk. He paused. Heard what happened, that you got thrown out. Mara's jaw tightened. What do you want? Like I said, I'm offering you a choice. Elias looked at her steadily. You can stay here, freeze, starve, maybe find some other job that pays even less and treats you even worse, or what? You can come with me. Mara stared at him. Where? Into the mountains. I've got a cabin up there. It's not much, but it's warm. And it's safe. Why would you do that? Elias shrugged. Because you need help, and I'm offering it. I don't... Mara stopped, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to say she didn't need his help, that she could take care of herself. But it wasn't true. She couldn't. Not anymore. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. Nothing. Everyone wants something. Then I guess I'm not everyone. Elias took a step back, giving her space. Think about it. I'll be at the north edge of town at dawn. If you want to come, meet me there. If not, I won't bother you again. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark. Mara sat there, her mind racing. She didn't trust him, couldn't, but she also didn't have any other options. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Mara made her decision. She grabbed her bag and started walking, toward the edge of town, toward Elias Crow. toward a future she couldn't see but had no choice but to step into. Elias was waiting where he said he'd be, standing beside a horse that looked as solid and unbothered as he did. The animal was a dark bay, thick-bodied, the kind built for endurance rather than speed. There was a pack mule tied beside it, already loaded with supplies. Mara approached slowly, her bag clutched in one hand, her breath fogging in the dawn air. She half expected him to look surprised or pleased or something, but his expression didn't change. He just gave a small nod, like he'd known all along she'd come. "You ride?" he asked. "Not really." "You'll learn." He untied the mule's lead rope and handed it to her. "Hold on to this. She'll follow the horse." Mara took the rope, her fingers stiff with cold. "What's her name?" "Mule." That's not a name." "It's what she is." Elias swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of years in the mountains. He looked down at Mara, waiting. She wrapped the lead rope around her hand and started walking. The mule followed without complaint, her hooves crunching on the frozen ground. They left Coldwater Ridge behind as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, turning the sky from gray to pale gold. Mara didn't look back. There was nothing there she wanted to see again. For the first hour, they walked in silence. The road out of town was rutted and half-frozen, lined with stumps where the timber crews had been working. The forest started about a mile past the last building, rising up on either side like walls. The trees here were massive, fir and pine and cedar, their trunks so wide it would take 3 men to circle them. Mara had seen forests before, but nothing like this. This felt ancient, untouched. "You ever been in the mountains?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the quiet. "No? It's different up there. Quieter, colder, but honest." Mara wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she didn't ask. She was too focused on keeping her feet under her. The road had started to climb, and every step seemed harder than the last. Her boots weren't made for this. Neither was she. By midday, they'd left the road entirely. Elias guided the horse onto a narrow trail that wound through the trees, barely wide enough for the mule to pass. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and roots that caught at Mara's feet. She stumbled more than once, catching herself on tree trunks, her hands scraped raw. "You need to stop?" Elias called back. "No." He didn't push, just kept riding. The truth was, Mara did need to stop. Her legs were shaking, her lungs burning, and she was pretty sure she'd worn a blister through the side of her left foot. But she wasn't going to say it. She'd made the choice to come. She wasn't going to prove him wrong in the first few hours. They stopped when the light started to fade, in a small clearing where a stream cut through the rocks. Elias dismounted and began unpacking the mule with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same task 1,000 times. Mara stood off to the side, unsure what to do. "You just going to stand there?" Elias asked without looking up. "What do you want me to do?" "Gather firewood. Dry stuff. Nothing green." Mara set down her bag and started searching the edge of the clearing. It took longer than she expected. Most of the wood on the ground was damp or rotted through. She had to dig through the underbrush to find pieces that weren't soaked. By the time she came back with an armful, Elias had already set up a small fire ring and laid out his bedroll. He took the wood from her without comment and started building the fire. Mara watched, feeling useless. He didn't use any kindling, just a piece of flint and steel, striking sparks into a nest of dried moss he'd pulled from his coat pocket. The fire caught almost immediately, small flames licking up through the wood. "Sit," Elias said, nodding toward a flat rock near the fire. Mara sat. The warmth felt like a miracle. Elias pulled a tin pot from one of the packs and filled it with water from the stream. He set it on the fire, then added a handful of something from a cloth sack, dried meat, beans, some kind of grain. It didn't look like much, but when it started to simmer, the smell made Mara's stomach twist with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. "How long until we get there?" she asked. 2 more days, maybe 3, depending on the weather. "Is it always this cold?" "This is nothing. Wait till we get higher." Mara pulled her coat tighter. She didn't have anything warmer. Elias seemed to notice. "There's a blanket in the pack," he said. "Use it tonight." "What about you?" "I'll be fine." They ate in silence. The stew was plain but hot, and Mara ate every bite, scraping the bowl clean with her fingers. Elias handed her a second serving without asking if she wanted it. She took it. When they finished, he rinsed the pot in the stream, and set it aside to dry. Then he sat back against a log, his arms crossed, his gaze on the fire. "You don't talk much," Mara said. "Neither do you." "I talk when there's something to say." "Same." Mara studied him in the firelight. He was older than she'd thought at first, maybe closer to 50. His face was lined, weathered, the kind of face that had spent more time outside than in. There was a scar running along his jawline, faint but visible, and his hands were calloused in a way that spoke of hard work. He didn't look like someone who spent time around people. He looked like someone who'd chosen not to. "Why'd you help me?" Mara asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Didn't like the way they were looking at you." "That's it? That's enough. Most people would have walked past." "I'm not most people." Mara wanted to push, to ask more, but something in his tone told her he wouldn't answer, so she let it drop. The fire burned low. Elias added another log, then stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, his rifle in hand. He stood there for a while, just listening, scanning the dark. When he came back, he looked relaxed. "Get some sleep," he said. "We leave at first light." Mara pulled the blanket from the pack and wrapped it around herself. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, and it was warmer than anything she'd had in months. She lay down near the fire, using her bag as a pillow, and closed her eyes. She didn't think she'd be able to sleep. Her mind was too full, her body too sore, but exhaustion won. The last thing she heard was the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the trees. When she woke, it was still dark. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept back in. Elias was already awake, moving quietly around the camp, repacking the mule. He glanced over when he saw her sit up. "Morning." Mara rubbed her eyes. "What time is it?" "Early. We've got a lot of ground to cover." They ate a quick breakfast, more stew, reheated from the night before, and then they were moving again. The trail climbed steadily, winding higher into the mountains. The trees began to thin, replaced by stretches of open rock and scrub. The air got colder, sharper, and Mara's breath came harder. By mid-morning, her legs felt like they were made of stone. Every step was an effort, and the blister on her foot had opened, leaving a wet spot in her boot that stung with every movement. She gritted her teeth and kept going. Elias glanced back at her every now and then, but he didn't say anything. Mara was grateful for that. She didn't want his pity. They stopped briefly at noon, eating dried meat and hard biscuits while the mule drank from a snowmelt stream. Mara sat on a rock, pulling off her boot to check her foot. The blister was worse than she'd thought, raw and angry, starting to bleed. She grimaced and shoved her boot back on. "Let me see," Elias said. "It's fine." "Let me see." Mara hesitated, then pulled the boot off again. Elias crouched down and examined her foot, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and walked to the mule, rummaging through one of the packs. He came back with a small tin and a strip of clean cloth. "This'll help," he said, opening the tin. Inside was a thick, yellowish salve that smelled like pine and something medicinal. He scooped some out with his fingers and spread it over the blister, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then he wrapped her foot with the cloth, tying it off securely. "That should hold till tonight," he said. "But you need better boots." "I don't have better boots." "I know." He didn't say anything else, just packed the tin away and swung back onto his horse. They kept moving. The landscape changed as they climbed. The trees grew shorter, twisted by wind and weather. Snow appeared in patches, then in drifts, then everywhere. The trail became harder to follow, just a faint line through the white. Mara's feet went numb, and her fingers ached inside her gloves. She wanted to ask how much farther, but she knew it wouldn't matter. They'd get there when they got there. The sun was starting to sink when Elias finally stopped. They were on a ridge looking down into a narrow valley. Mara could see a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere below, barely visible against the darkening sky. "That's it," Elias said. "The cabin." Mara squinted, trying to see, but all she could make out were trees and shadows. "Come on," Elias said. "We'll be there before full dark." The descent into the valley was steep and treacherous. Mara had to grab onto the mule's lead rope to keep from slipping, her boots sliding on the icy rocks. By the time they reached the bottom, her hands were shaking and her breath was coming in ragged gasps. The cabin sat in a small clearing tucked against the base of a cliff. It was smaller than Mara had imagined, just one room, built from rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney rising from one end. Smoke curled from the chimney, and there was a faint glow of firelight in the single window. "Someone's inside," Mara said. "That's Bram, my partner." Mara's stomach tightened. "You didn't mention a partner." "You didn't ask." Elias dismounted and led the horse toward a small lean-to beside the cabin. Mara followed, her nerves on edge. She didn't know what she'd expected, but it wasn't this. Another person meant another set of eyes, another judgment, another complication. The door to the cabin opened before they reached it, and a man stepped out. He was shorter than Elias, stockier, with a thick beard and sharp eyes that took in Mara in one quick sweep. "Who's this?" he asked. "Her name's Mara," Elias said. "She's staying with us for a while." Bram's eyebrows went up. "Staying with us. That a problem?" Bram looked at Mara again, then at Elias. "We gonna talk about this?" "Later." Bram grunted but stepped aside. Elias gestured for Mara to go in. The inside of the cabin was warmer than Mara had felt in days. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and there were furs piled on a rough wooden bed in the corner. The space smelled like smoke and coffee, and something cooking. Venison, maybe. It was sparse, but it was solid. Real. Mara stood just inside the door, unsure where to put herself. Bram was watching her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You got a last name, Mara?" he asked. "Vance." "Where you from?" "Back east. Pennsylvania. Long way from home." "I don't have a home." Bram's eyes flicked to Elias, who was hauling gear inside. "That why you brought her here?" "I brought her here because she needed help," Elias said evenly. "Same reason we've helped anyone else." Bram didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He just shook his head and went back to the fire, stirring whatever was in the pot. Elias set Mara's bag down near the wall. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding toward a spot near the fire. "It's the warmest." "Where do you sleep?" "We take turns keeping watch. One of us is always up." "Watch for what?" "Bears, wolves, men." Elias pulled off his coat and hung it on a peg. "Mostly men." Mara swallowed. She hadn't thought about that, hadn't thought about much beyond getting out of Coldwater Ridge. But now, standing in this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, the reality of it started to sink in. She was alone with two men she didn't know, in a place no one could find her. If they wanted to hurt her, there was nothing she could do about it. Elias seemed to sense her fear. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "I give you my word." "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I'd wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already." It wasn't comforting, exactly, but it was honest, and somehow that mattered. Bram ladled stew into 3 bowls and handed them out without ceremony. They ate sitting on rough benches near the fire, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the scrape of spoons against tin. Mara ate slowly, watching the two men. They didn't talk much, but there was an ease between them, a rhythm that spoke of years spent in close quarters. When they finished, Bram stood and stretched. "I'll take first watch," he said, pulling on his coat. "Wake me at midnight," Elias replied. Bram grunted and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Elias looked at Mara. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today." "Harder how?" "You'll see." He didn't elaborate, just banked the fire and settled into a chair near the window, his rifle across his lap. Mara lay down on the pile of furs Elias had indicated, pulling the blanket over herself. The floor was hard, but the warmth from the fire seeped into her bones, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safe. She didn't trust it, couldn't, but she let herself sink into it anyway, just for tonight. Tomorrow, she'd figure out what came next. The next morning started before the sun. Mara woke to the sound of Elias moving around the cabin, stoking the fire, setting a kettle on to boil. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, and when she tried to sit up, her muscles screamed in protest. "Coffee?" Elias asked, not looking at her. "Please." He poured her a cup, strong, bitter, no sugar. Mara wrapped her hands around it and drank, feeling the heat spread through her chest. Bram came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots. "Storm's coming," he said. "We've got maybe a day before it hits." "Then we work fast," Elias said. Work? Mara asked. Elias looked at her. You want to stay here? You pull your weight. That's the deal. I didn't agree to a deal. You came, didn't you? Mara set her cup down. What do you want me to do? For now, learn, watch, don't get in the way. It wasn't what she'd expected, but it was clear there was no room for argument. Mara nodded. They spent the day working. Elias showed her how to split kindling, how to stack it so it would dry properly. He showed her how to melt snow for water, how to check the snares he'd set around the clearing. Bram worked on repairing a section of the lean-to that had started to sag, his movements efficient and practiced. Mara's hands blistered within the first hour. The axe was heavier than she'd anticipated, and her aim was terrible. More than once, she missed the wood entirely, the blade biting into the stump with a jarring thud that rattled her arms. Elias watched, but didn't correct her. He just let her figure it out. By midday, she'd managed to split a small pile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Good, Elias said, inspecting her work. You'll get faster. How long did it take you? Couple years, Mara laughed, surprising herself. Elias almost smiled. That night the wind picked up. Mara could hear it howling outside, rattling the shutters, shaking the cabin walls. The fire burned hot, but the cold still crept in through the gaps in the logs. How bad will it get? Mara asked. Bad, Bram said, but we've weathered worse. What if it doesn't stop? It always stops. Mara wasn't sure if that was supposed to be reassuring. The storm hit just before dawn. Mara woke to the sound of wind screaming like something alive, battering the cabin with fists of snow and ice. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw Elias standing by the window, looking out into the white. How long will it last? She asked. Don't know. Could be a day, could be a week. A week? Maybe longer. Mara's chest tightened. She thought about the people back in Coldwater Ridge, going about their lives, safe and warm. She thought about Mrs. Pritchard, probably already replacing her with some other desperate girl. She thought about Vern, probably drinking at the saloon, laughing about how he'd run her out of town. And then she thought about the fact that none of them knew where she was. None of them could touch her here. For the first time since leaving, she felt something that wasn't fear. It felt like possibility. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being trapped inside the cabin, the world outside reduced to a wall of white noise and wind. Mara learned the rhythms of the space, Elias and Bram trading off watch, cooking, repairing gear. She learned to stay out of the way, to anticipate what needed doing before being asked. On the second day, Elias handed her a knife and a piece of leather. What's this for? She asked. Your boots. They're falling apart. You need new soles. I don't know how to do that. Then you'll learn. He showed her once how to cut the leather, how to stitch it, how to make the stitches tight enough to hold but not so tight they'd tear. Then he left her to it. Mara worked slowly, her fingers clumsy, her stitches uneven. It took her the better part of the day, and when she finished, the sole looked lumpy and awkward, but it held. Not bad, Elias said when she showed him. It's terrible. It's better than nothing. By the third day, the storm started to break. The wind died down, and the snow stopped falling. Elias opened the door and stepped outside, squinting at the white expanse. Mara followed, and the cold hit her like a punch. The world had been transformed. Everything was buried under snow, 3 feet, maybe more. The clearing was unrecognizable. The shapes of trees and rocks softened into smooth, alien forms. We'll need to dig out the lean-to, Bram said, already pulling on his coat. Mara helped. It was hard work, shoveling snow with a flat piece of wood, her shoulders burning, her breath coming in harsh gasps. But she kept at it, driven by something she couldn't name. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the need to prove she could. When they finally cleared the lean-to, Elias nodded at her. You did good. It wasn't much, but it felt like everything. That night, sitting by the fire, Bram asked her a question. Why'd you leave? Mara looked at him. Leave where? Coldwater Ridge, town like that, rough as it is. At least it's got people. What made you walk away? Mara thought about it. About Vern's hand on her arm. About Mrs. Pritchard's cold dismissal. About the way she'd felt like she was disappearing bit by bit every day she stayed. I didn't have a choice, she said finally. Everyone's got a choice. Not when all the choices are bad. Bram grunted. He didn't push, but later when Elias was outside checking the snares, Bram spoke again. He doesn't bring people here, he said. Not unless he thinks they're worth it. Mara looked at him. Worth what? Saving. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The days started to blur together. Mara fell into a routine, waking at dawn, helping with chores, learning whatever Elias or Bram would teach her. She learned to check snares, to skin rabbits, to tell which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. She learned to read the weather, to listen to the forest, to move quietly. It was hard, harder than anything she'd ever done. But it was also the first time in her life she felt like she was building something instead of just surviving. And then, on the 7th day, everything changed. Mara was outside hauling water from the stream when she heard the sound. Horses. Multiple. Coming up the valley. She dropped the bucket and ran back to the cabin. Elias was already at the window, his rifle in hand, his face grim. How many? Bram asked, moving to join him. 4. Maybe 5. Mara's stomach dropped. Who is it? Elias didn't answer. He just cocked the rifle and stepped outside. Mara followed, her heart pounding. The riders came into view a moment later, 5 men on horseback, moving slowly through the snow. Mara recognized the one in front immediately. Vern. He looked worse than Mara remembered. Thinner, meaner, his face half hidden behind a scarf wrapped against the cold. But the eyes were the same. Cold and certain, like he owned whatever he was looking at. The men behind him were loggers she recognized from town. Hard men. The kind who'd follow Vern because they had nothing better to do or because they were getting paid. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. Another had his hand resting on a pistol at his hip. Elias stood in front of the cabin, his rifle held loosely but ready. Bram appeared from around the side of the lean-to, moving to flank him, his own weapon in hand. Mara stayed behind them, her pulse hammering in her throat. Vern pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. He looked at Elias, then at Bram, then finally at Mara. His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. There she is, he said. Been looking for you, girl. Mara didn't answer. Her throat had gone dry. You've got no business here, Elias said, his voice level. Vern's eyes shifted to him. That's so. Because from where I'm sitting, I've got plenty of business. That girl owes a debt. She doesn't owe you anything. Not me. Mrs. Pritchard. See, when she left, she still had wages owed. And Mrs. Pritchard, she don't like people running out on their obligations. Mrs. Pritchard threw her out, Elias said. There's no debt. Vern shrugged. That's between you and her, I guess. But I'm here to collect. So why don't you just hand her over and we'll be on our way? That's not happening. Vern's expression hardened. You really want to do this, old man? There's 5 of us, 2 of you. I can count. One of the men behind Vern shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his rifle. Bram noticed. His grip tightened on his own weapon. Careful, Bram said quietly. The man froze. Vern looked between them, calculating. Mara could see it in his eyes. He was trying to figure out if this was worth the risk, if Elias and Bram would actually fight, if he could take them. She's just a girl, Vern said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. Not worth dying over. Maybe not to you, Elias replied. You don't even know her. I know enough. Vern's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be the first time. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind had died down, and the silence stretched out, heavy and dangerous. Mara's hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. Then Vern pulled his scarf down, revealing the full sneer on his face. Fine. Have it your way. But this doesn't end here. You understand me? This doesn't end. He yanked his horse's reins, turning it around. The other men followed, casting wary glances back at Elias and Bram. They rode off slowly, deliberately, making a show of not being intimidated. But they left. Mara didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until they disappeared into the trees. Then it came out all at once, shaky and uneven. Elias lowered his rifle but didn't relax. Get inside. Are they inside? Now. Mara went. Her legs felt weak, disconnected from her body. She stumbled through the door and sank onto the bench near the fire, her hands still trembling. Elias and Bram stayed outside for another few minutes, watching, listening. When they finally came in, their expressions were grim. "They'll be back," Bram said, setting his rifle by the door. "I know. How many you think he'll bring next time?" "More than 5. Bram cursed under his breath and ran a hand through his beard. "We can't hold off a dozen men. Not up here. Not if they're serious." Elias didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the fire, his jaw working. Mara couldn't take it anymore. "I'll go back." Both men looked at her. "I'll go back," she said again. "I'll tell them it was my idea, that you didn't know. That way they won't—" "No," Elias said flatly. "But I said no." "You heard him. He's going to come back with more men. People are going to get hurt because of me." "People get hurt all the time," Bram said, his tone sharper than usual. "Doesn't mean you roll over and let it happen. I'm not asking you to die for me." "We're not dying," Elias said. We're preparing." Mara stared at him. "Preparing how?" Elias finally looked at her, and his expression was unreadable. "You said you wanted to stay. That means you stand with us. You don't run. You don't hide. You fight." "I don't know how to fight." "Then you'll learn that too." The next few days were a blur of frantic preparation. Elias and Bram moved with a purpose Mara hadn't seen before, their easy rhythm replaced by something harder, more urgent. They reinforced the cabin door with extra planks, nailed shutters over the windows, and dug shallow trenches around the clearing to slow anyone trying to approach on foot. Mara helped where she could, hauling supplies, holding boards while Bram hammered, fetching tools. But mostly, she watched. And she learned. Elias started teaching her to shoot. They set up targets, pieces of wood nailed to trees at varying distances, and he handed her an old rifle that looked like it had seen better days. "It kicks," he warned. "Don't lock your shoulder or it'll knock you on your ass." Mara took the rifle, surprised by how heavy it was. She'd never held a gun before. Never wanted to. But now, standing in the clearing with Vern's face burned into her memory, she wanted to know how to use it. Elias showed her how to load it, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. Then he stepped back. "Hit the target." Mara raised the rifle, trying to remember everything he'd said. The weight of it made her arms shake. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed. The rifle kicked harder than she expected. The shot went wide, missing the tree entirely. Mara stumbled back, her shoulder already aching. "Again," Elias said. She shot again, and again, and again. By the 10th shot, her shoulder was bruised, her ears were ringing, and she still hadn't hit the target. Frustration burned in her chest. "I can't do this," she said, lowering the rifle. "Yes, you can." "I'm not hitting anything." "Not yet." Elias took the rifle from her and reloaded it with practiced ease. "But you will. You just need to stop thinking about it so much." "How am I supposed to not think about it?" "Stop worrying about missing. Just focus on the target. Everything else will follow." He handed the rifle back. Mara raised it, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She stared at the piece of wood nailed to the tree, her vision narrowing. She took a breath, let it out halfway, and squeezed. The rifle kicked. The wood splintered. Mara lowered the rifle, stunned. "There," Elias said. "Now do it again." By the end of the week, Mara could hit the target more often than she missed. It wasn't perfect. Her groupings were all over the place, and her hand still shook when she loaded, but it was progress. And progress, Elias told her, was all that mattered. Bram taught her other things. How to move quietly through snow without leaving obvious tracks. How to use a knife, not to fight, but to defend. How to think 3 steps ahead, to anticipate where an attacker might come from, and how to position herself so she wasn't cornered. "Most men expect women to freeze," Bram said, circling her in the clearing. "They expect you to scream or beg or run. You do any of that and you're dead. So you don't freeze, you move. You hurt them first and you don't stop until they're down." Mara tried to absorb it all, but it felt overwhelming. She wasn't a fighter. She'd spent her whole life trying to be invisible, to avoid conflict. Now these men were asking her to stand and face it head on. One night, sitting by the fire after another long day of training, Mara finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her. Why are you doing this? Elias looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. Doing what? All of this. Teaching me. Risking your lives. You don't owe me anything. Elias was quiet for a moment, his knife moving over the wood in slow, deliberate strokes. Then he said, You ever hear about the timber wars? Mara shook her head. Happened about 10 years back. Big companies came in, started buying up land, cutting deals with the government. Anyone who stood in their way got pushed out. Some got bought off, some got worse. What happened to you? I had a claim. Small piece of land, nothing special, but it was mine. They wanted it. I said no. They sent men to convince me otherwise. Mara waited. They burned my house, Elias said quietly. Killed my dog. Left me a message saying if I didn't leave, they'd do worse. So I left. Came up here. Built this place. And I swore I'd never let anyone push me around again. Is that why you helped me? Because you saw yourself? No. Elias looked at her, his expression serious. I helped you because you reminded me of my daughter. Mara's breath caught. You have a daughter? Had. His voice didn't waver, but something in his eyes went distant. She got sick, fever, couldn't afford a doctor. By the time I scraped together enough money, it was too late. I'm sorry. Elias shook his head. Don't be, it was a long time ago. But when I saw you in that alley, I saw her. Saw the same look in your eyes, like the world had already written you off. He paused. I wasn't going to let that happen again. Mara didn't know what to say. The weight of it, the grief, the guilt, the years of carrying it alone, pressed down on her like a physical thing. I'm not her, Mara said softly. I know, but maybe that's the point. Bram, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. He's trying to say you get a second chance. Don't waste it. Mara looked between them, these two hard men who'd chosen to stand between her and the world. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she was starting to. I won't, she said. 2 weeks passed. The snow started to melt, turning the clearing into a muddy mess. The days got longer, the nights less brutal. But the tension never left. Elias and Bram stayed vigilant, taking turns on watch, scanning the tree line for movement. Mara kept training. She got better with the rifle, faster with the knife. Her hands stopped shaking when she loaded. Her aim got steadier. She still wasn't good, not like Elias or Bram, but she was competent. And competent she was learning, could be enough. Then, one morning, the waiting ended. Mara was outside checking the snares when she heard it. Horses again. A lot of them. She dropped the rabbit she'd just pulled from the trap and ran back to the cabin. Elias was already outside, his rifle in hand, his face set. How many? Bram asked, appearing from the lean-to. Too many. They came into view a moment later, 12 men, maybe more, spread out in a loose line. Vern was at the front, flanked by the same men from before. But there were new faces, too. Rougher, meaner, the kind of men who'd done this before. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, just out of rifle range. Vern dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He walked forward slowly, his hands raised in a show of peace. Elias Crow, he called out, we need to talk. Elias didn't move. Nothing to talk about? I think there is. See, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I realized something. You're right, that girl doesn't owe me anything, but she does owe the town. The town? Vern nodded. She took charity, took a job, a place to sleep, and then she ran off without paying what she owed. Now, I know you're an honorable man, so I'm giving you a choice. Send her back, and we'll call it square. No one gets hurt. And if I don't? Vern's expression hardened. Then we take her, and anyone who tries to stop us goes down with her. Mara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She looked at Elias, waiting for him to respond, to tell Vern to go to hell. But he didn't say anything. He just stood there, rifle raised, staring Vern down. You've got 10 seconds, Vern said. Then we come in. Elias, Bram started. I know. The seconds ticked by. Mara's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something sharper. Anger. These men had come all this way to drag her back, to own her, to make her nothing again. And she was done being nothing. Mara stepped forward, moving past Elias before he could stop her. She walked out into the clearing, her boots squelching in the mud, her chin raised. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice carrying across the space. Vern looked surprised. Then he laughed. "You don't get to decide that, sweetheart." "Yes, I do." "No, you don't. You're coming with us one way or another." "Then you'll have to drag me." Vern's smile faded. "If that's how you want it." He gestured to the men behind him. 3 of them started forward, dismounting, spreading out, and that's when Elias fired. The shot cracked through the air like thunder. One of the men went down, clutching his leg, screaming. The others froze. "Next one's in your chest," Elias said, his voice calm. Vern's face twisted with rage. "You just made the worst mistake of your life, old man. Won't be the first time." The clearing erupted. Men scrambled for cover as Elias and Bram opened fire, their shots precise and deliberate. Mara dove behind a stack of firewood, her heart racing, her hands fumbling for the rifle she'd left by the cabin door. She grabbed it, loaded it with shaking hands, and raised it. One of Vern's men was running toward her, his pistol drawn. Mara aimed, breathed, and fired. She missed. The man didn't. His shot splintered the wood next to her head, sending splinters into her cheek. Mara ducked, reloaded, tried again. This time she hit him. Not a kill shot, just his shoulder. But it was enough. He went down, cursing, and didn't get back up. The fight was chaos. Gunfire, shouting, smoke. Mara lost track of who was where. She just kept shooting, reloading, shooting again. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but she didn't stop. And then, suddenly, it was over. The men who were still standing were retreating, dragging their wounded with them. Vern was screaming at them to stand and fight, but they weren't listening. They'd had enough. Elias stood in the middle of the clearing, his rifle smoking, his eyes cold. "If you come back," he called after them, "we won't aim for legs next time." Vern glared at him, his face red with fury. But he didn't argue. He just climbed onto his horse and rode off, the others following. Mara lowered her rifle, her hands still shaking. She looked at Elias, then at Bram, then down at the man she'd shot. He was still breathing, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain. "What do we do with him?" she asked. Elias walked over, looked down at the man, then back at Mara. "Patch him up. Send him back with the others." "Why?" "So they know we're not killers, just people who won't be pushed." Bram hauled the man to his feet, none too gently, and half carried him to the edge of the clearing. The man stumbled off, disappearing into the trees. Mara stood there, her rifle still in her hands, her mind reeling. She'd just shot someone, actually shot them. And she didn't feel guilty. She didn't feel anything except relief. She'd stood her ground, she'd fought, and she'd won. Elias walked over to her, his expression unreadable. "You did good." "I almost got killed." "Almost, but you didn't." Mara looked at him, then down at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe, but next time we'll be ready." Bram joined them, his face grim. "We need to move the camp, set up somewhere harder to find." "Agreed. We'll leave tomorrow." Mara looked between them. "Where will we go?" "Higher," Elias said. "Deeper into the mountains. Somewhere they can't follow." That night they packed everything they could carry. The cabin, the place that had been Mara's first real shelter in months, was left behind. It felt wrong, abandoning it. But Elias was right. Staying meant being found, and being found meant more fighting. They left at first light, the mule loaded down, the valley disappearing behind them. Mara didn't look back. There was nothing there she needed anymore. The climb was brutal, steeper, colder, harder than anything they'd done before. But Mara kept moving, one foot in front of the other, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her jaw set. She wasn't the same girl who'd stumbled out of Coldwater Ridge 2 months ago. That girl had been small, afraid, invisible. This girl was something else. The new camp was barely a camp at all, just a rock outcropping that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth, offering enough shelter from the wind to keep a fire alive. No walls, no roof, nothing but stone and sky and the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. Mara had stopped complaining about the cold weeks ago. There was no point. It was always cold. That was just how things were now. They'd been at the outcropping for 5 days, and in that time, Mara had learned more about survival than she had in her entire life before. She learned that you could eat pine bark if you scraped away the outer layer and boiled the soft inner part. She learned that you could tell which way was south by watching where the snow melted first on the trees. She learned that hunger was something you could get used to, that it became background noise after a while, like wind or cold or the ache in your legs. Elias barely spoke anymore. He moved through the days with a kind of grim efficiency, checking traps, rationing supplies, always watching the valley below for signs of movement. Bram was quieter too, his usual gruffness replaced by something harder. The fight at the cabin had changed things. They'd crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Mara sat near the fire, scraping the last bits of meat from a rabbit bone with her knife. It wasn't much. They'd been stretching their kills as far as they could go. But it was something. She'd gotten good at making nothing last. "We're running low on powder," Bram said, crouching beside Elias near the edge of the outcropping. 3 more days, maybe 4, if we're careful." "Then we need to go down," Elias replied. "Down where?" "Bennett's Creek. There's a trading post. Old man named Cyrus runs it. He'll have what we need." "You trust him?" "I trust his greed more than his morals. He won't turn us in if there's money in it." Bram nodded slowly. "What about her?" Both men glanced at Mara. She pretended not to notice, focusing on the bone. "She comes with us," Elias said. "Can't leave her here alone. She'll slow us down." "Maybe. But I'm not leaving her." Bram grunted but didn't argue. He stood and walked back to the fire, settling down with his back against a rock. "When do we leave?" "Dawn." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay on her bedroll, staring up at the stars, her mind racing. The idea of going back down into civilization, even a place as remote as a trading post, made her stomach twist. She'd gotten used to the mountains, to the silence, to the fact that up here, no one was looking for her. Going back down meant risk, meant exposure, but they needed supplies. And Elias was right. She couldn't stay here alone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She rolled onto her side and watched the fire burn low, the embers glowing like tiny eyes in the dark. Across from her, Elias sat with his rifle across his lap, keeping watch as always. He never seemed to sleep, just dozed in short bursts, always alert, always ready. "You worried?" he asked without looking at her. Mara startled. She hadn't realized he knew she was awake. "About what?" "Going back down." She considered lying, then decided against it. "Yeah." "Good. Means you're paying attention." "What if someone recognizes me?" "Then we deal with it." Elias finally looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "But you're not the same person you were 2 months ago. People see what they expect to see, and they're not expecting you to be with us." Mara wasn't sure if that was supposed to be comforting. It wasn't. They left before the sun cleared the ridge, moving down through the trees in single file. Elias led, Bram brought up the rear, and Mara stayed in the middle with the mule. The descent was easier than the climb had been, but it still took most of the day. By the time they reached the valley floor, Mara's legs were shaking and her feet were numb. Bennett's Creek wasn't a town. It was barely a settlement. Just a handful of rough buildings clustered around a shallow ford in the creek, surrounded by stumps and mud. The trading post sat at the center, a squat log structure with a sagging porch and a hand-painted sign that read, "Cyrus Mercantile," in faded letters. Elias dismounted and tied his horse to the rail outside. "Stay close," he said to Mara. "Don't talk unless you have to." She nodded. Inside, the trading post smelled like tobacco and leather and something vaguely rotten. Shelves lined the walls stocked with tools, traps, canned goods, and bolts of cloth. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, radiating heat. Behind the counter stood an old man with a face like weathered bark and eyes sharp enough to gut fish. "Elias Crow," the old man said, his voice raspy. "Heard you were dead." "Not yet, Cyrus." "Pity. Would have saved me the trouble of dealing with you." Cyrus's gaze slid to Mara, lingering for a moment before moving to Bram. "Who's the girl?" "None of your business." "Fair enough." Cyrus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "What do you need?" "Powder, shot, coffee if you've got it, salt." "I've got it. Question is, can you pay for it?" Elias pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and set it on the counter. Cyrus opened it, peered inside, then whistled low. Pelts? Good ones. Where'd you get them? Does it matter? Cyrus grinned, showing yellowed teeth. Suppose not. He scooped up the pouch and disappeared into the back room. Mara could hear him rummaging around, muttering to himself. Bram moved to the window, watching the street outside. Mara stayed near Elias, her hands shoved in her pockets, trying to look smaller than she was. Cyrus returned with a canvas sack, which he dropped on the counter with a thud. Powder, shot, salt, no coffee. Haven't had any in weeks. Best I can do is chicory root. Fine. Cyrus eyed Mara again. She looks familiar. Mara's heart stopped. She's got one of those faces, Elias said evenly. Maybe. Or maybe I've seen her before. Cyrus scratched his chin. You in some kind of trouble, girl? No, Mara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Cyrus didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Suit yourself. Just don't bring your trouble into my store. Elias picked up the sack and turned to leave. Mara followed, her pulse hammering. They were almost to the door when it swung open, nearly hitting her in the face. A woman stepped through, bundled in a heavy coat, her face red from the cold. She was middle-aged, sturdy, with sharp eyes that swept the room in one practiced glance. When they landed on Mara, they narrowed. I know you, the woman said. Mara froze. The woman stepped closer, squinting. You're that girl, the one who worked for Pritchard. Mara didn't answer. Couldn't. Thought you ran off, the woman continued. Pritchard's been telling everyone you stole from her. That's a lie, Mara said, the words out before she could stop them. Is it? Because Pritchard says you took money, says you owe her. I don't owe her anything. She threw me out. The woman's expression softened slightly. That's so? Yeah. There was a long pause. Then the woman sighed. Figures. Pritchard's a piece of work. Always has been. She glanced at Elias, then back at Mara. You in good hands now? Mara hesitated, then nodded. Good. Stay away from Coldwater Ridge. Nothing there but trouble. The woman moved past them toward the counter, dismissing them entirely. Outside, Mara's legs nearly gave out. She leaned against the porch rail, her breath coming in short gasps. You did good, Elias said quietly. I almost panicked. But you didn't. Bram appeared with the horses. We need to move. Now. They left Bennett's Creek without looking back, pushing hard until the settlement disappeared behind the trees. Only then did Elias slow the pace, letting the horses breathe. That was close, Bram said. Too close, Elias agreed. We won't come back here. Mara didn't argue. She was too busy trying to calm her racing heart. They made camp that night in a dense thicket of pines, the kind of place where the trees grew so close together you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. It felt safer than the open outcropping, hidden, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She said as much to Elias as they ate a sparse dinner of hardtack and dried venison. You're not wrong, he said. These mountains have eyes. Animals mostly. But sometimes men. How do you know the difference? Animals don't try to hide what they're doing. Men do. Mara chewed slowly, thinking. You ever wish you'd just stayed in one place, built a real home? Elias was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I did, once. Didn't work out. Because of the timber companies? Because I thought I could make a life in a place that didn't want me. Took me too long to figure out you can't force roots into rock. He looked at her. You're learning that now, faster than I did. I didn't have a choice. Everyone's got a choice. You chose to leave. You chose to come with me. You chose to fight. Those are choices, Mara. Don't pretend they're not. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The days started to blur together again. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. Elias and Bram taught her more, how to set snares, how to track animals, how to read the land. She got better, stronger. Her hands toughened, her aim improved, and the fear that had lived in her chest for so long started to fade, replaced by something harder. One morning, about 3 weeks after the trip to Bennett's Creek, Mara woke to find Bram gone. His bedroll was empty, his gear missing. Where is he? She asked Elias. Scouting. For what? Trouble. Mara's stomach tightened. You think Vern's still looking for us? I think men like Vern don't give up easy. Bram returned just after noon, his face grim. We've got a problem. Elias stood. How bad? Bad. There's a group camped about 2 miles east, 8 men, maybe more. They've got dogs. Vern? Didn't get close enough to see. But who else would it be? Elias cursed under his breath. How long until they find us? Day. Maybe 2 if the dogs lose the scent. Then we move. Now. They packed in minutes, their movements quick and practiced. Mara's hands didn't shake anymore. She just worked, loading the mule, checking her rifle, tying down her bedroll. This was what survival looked like. No time for fear, just action. They moved north, climbing higher, pushing into terrain so rough even the mule struggled. The trees thinned, replaced by jagged rocks and patches of ice that never melted. The air got thinner, harder to breathe, but they didn't stop. By nightfall, they'd put 5 miles between themselves and the camp Bram had spotted. Elias called a halt in a narrow ravine, sheltered on 3 sides by sheer rock walls. We'll hold here, he said. If they come, we'll see them before they see us. And if they don't come? Mara asked. Then we keep moving. They didn't light a fire that night. Too risky. Instead, they huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Mara's teeth chattered despite the layers of clothing, and her fingers ached with cold. You think they'll give up? She asked quietly. No, Elias said, but I think they'll get tired. Men like that, they're used to quick wins. The longer this drags out, the more it costs them. Eventually, it won't be worth it. How long is eventually? Don't know, but we'll outlast them. We have to. Mara closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. How long could they keep running? The answer came 3 days later. They were moving through a narrow pass when Bram spotted movement below. He signaled for silence, and they crouched behind a boulder, watching. 8 men on horseback picking their way through the rocks. Dogs ranged ahead of them, sniffing the ground, their noses low. And at the front, unmistakable even at a distance, was Vern. They're following our trail, Bram whispered. How'd they find us? Mara asked. Dogs, Elias said grimly. Good ones. What do we do? Elias scanned the terrain, his eyes calculating. We can't outrun them, not with the mule, and we can't fight them here. Too exposed. So what then? Elias looked at Bram. We split up. You take Mara and the mule, head west toward the ridge. I'll double back, lay a false trail, lead them away. That's suicide, Bram said flatly. It's the only way. No, we stick together. Bram, I said no. Bram's voice was hard as iron. We've been through worse. We'll figure it out. Elias stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, then we make a stand. Here? Not here. Up there. Elias pointed to a cluster of boulders higher up the pass. Narrow approach. High ground. If they want us, they'll have to come through a bottleneck. Bram grinned, a fierce, wolfish expression. Now you're talking. They moved quickly, positioning themselves among the boulders. Elias and Bram took up spots on either side of the pass, their rifles loaded and ready. Mara crouched behind a rock in the center, her own rifle in her hands, her heart pounding. The men came on slowly, the dogs pulling them forward. When they reached the base of the pass, Vern called a halt. He stared up at the rocks, his face unreadable. I know you're up there, Crow, he shouted. Elias didn't answer. This is your last chance. Send the girl down, and we'll let you walk away. Still no answer. Vern's face twisted with rage. Fine, have it your way. He gestured to his men, and they started up the pass, spreading out, their weapons drawn. The dogs lunged ahead, barking, their teeth bared. Elias fired first. The lead dog went down, yelping. The others scattered, confused. The men dove for cover, shouting, returning fire. The pass erupted in chaos. Bullets ricocheted off rocks, sending chips of stone flying. Mara ducked, her ears ringing, her hands shaking. She forced herself to breathe, to aim, to fire. One of Vern's men went down, then another. But they kept coming. Bram's rifle jammed. He cursed, fumbling to clear it. One of the men saw the opening and charged, his pistol raised. Mara swung her rifle toward him and fired without thinking. The man fell. Mara stared at him, her breath catching. She'd just killed someone. Actually killed them. Not wounded, killed. "Mara," Elias's voice cut through the fog. "Reload." She did, her hands moving on autopilot. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. The men started to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. Vern screamed at them to hold, but they weren't listening. They'd had enough. And then, suddenly, it was over. The pass fell silent. Smoke hung in the air, thick and acrid. Mara lowered her rifle, her hands still shaking, her ears still ringing. Elias and Bram emerged from their positions, their faces grim. Below, Vern stood alone, his men scattered, his dogs dead. He stared up at them, his expression twisted with fury and something else. Defeat. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Yes, it is," Elias called back. "Go home, Vern. It's over." For a long moment, Vern didn't move. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rocks. Mara sank to the ground, her legs giving out. She'd done it. They'd done it. They'd won. Elias crouched beside her. "You all right?" Mara nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. "I killed someone." "I know." "I didn't want to." "I know that too." Elias put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "But you did what you had to, and you're still here. That's what matters." Mara looked up at him, her eyes wet. "What if he comes back?" "He won't. Not after this." Elias stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, we need to move before anyone else shows up." Mara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, but she walked. One step at a time. They left the pass behind, moving deeper into the mountains, into a place where no one would follow. And for the first time since leaving Coldwater Ridge, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt free. The feeling didn't last. Freedom, Mara was learning, wasn't something you achieved once and kept forever. It was something you had to defend every single day, against a world that wanted to take it back, against circumstances that wanted to crush you, against the voice in your own head that whispered you didn't deserve it. They walked for 2 more days after the fight at the pass, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Vern's scattered men. The mountains grew wilder, more remote. The trees became stunted things clinging to rocky soil, twisted by wind and weather into shapes that looked almost human. The wind carried the smell of ice even though it should have been spring, and Mara's lungs burned with every breath in the thin air. They were higher than she'd ever been, in a place where the air itself felt foreign, where every step required conscious effort. On the 3rd day, just when Mara thought she couldn't walk another mile, they found it. A valley tucked between 2 peaks, sheltered from the worst of the wind by sheer rock walls that rose like cathedral spires on either side. A stream ran through the center, clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Unlike most of the water they'd encountered at this elevation, this stream hadn't frozen over. It moved too fast, tumbling over rocks with a sound like distant conversation. There were trees here, real ones, tall pines that whispered in the breeze and provided actual shelter. And at the far end of the valley, against the base of the western peak, was a natural cave, its mouth dark and inviting, deep enough to provide real shelter, high enough that winter snow wouldn't block the entrance. "This'll work," Elias said, dismounting. He walked the perimeter of the valley slowly, his eyes scanning every detail, the sight lines, the approaches, the places where someone could hide or defend. "Good water, good cover, hard to find unless you know it's here. Defensible." "We staying?" Bram asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "For now, maybe longer." Mara looked around, trying to see what Elias saw. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that didn't care whether you lived or died. That would be exactly the same whether humans were here or not. But it was also isolated, empty. She'd wanted to get away from people, from towns, from everything that had hurt her. But standing here in this remote valley, she realized that getting away was only half of it. The other half, the harder half, was figuring out what came next. What you built after you'd finished running. They spent the next week building. Not a cabin this time. That would take too long, require too many materials they didn't have, and would be too visible to anyone who might be looking. Instead, they fortified the cave, building a low stone wall across part of the entrance to block the wind and provide cover if they needed to defend the position. Bram fashioned a crude chimney from flat rocks, carefully angling it so the smoke would vent without creating an obvious plume that could be seen from the valley below. They stacked firewood inside where it would stay dry, organized their supplies, created separate sleeping areas. It was rough work, exhausting, the kind that left Mara's muscles screaming and her hands bleeding. But it felt good, purposeful. For the first time in her life, she was building something instead of just surviving in something someone else had built. Mara worked alongside the men, hauling stones that seemed impossibly heavy, gathering wood until her arms shook, her hands blistered and raw. She didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change anything, and besides, she was starting to take a strange pride in the pain. It meant she was doing something real, building something that mattered, becoming something other than a victim, other than someone things happened to. One evening, as they sat around the fire inside the cave, eating a sparse dinner of rabbit stew and hard biscuits, Bram asked the question Mara had been avoiding thinking about. "What's the plan here, Elias?" Elias looked up from the piece of leather he was working on, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "Plan? Yeah, we can't just hide up here forever. Eventually, we're going to run out of supplies. Winter's coming again in a few months, and you know how bad it gets up here. We barely made it through last winter in the lower cabin. Up here, it'll be worse." "I know." "So what's the plan?" Elias was quiet for a long time, his knife resuming its slow, deliberate movement over the leather. The firelight made shadows dance across his weathered face. Finally, he said, "We make this work. We trap, we hunt, we fish. We trade when we have to. We survive. And then what?" "What do you mean, and then what?" Bram gestured around the cave, his frustration evident. "This, all of this, what's the end goal? We just gonna live like this until we die? Is that what we're doing? You got a better idea?" "I'm asking if you do." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Mara watched, uncertain whether she should say something or stay quiet. She'd learned over the past months that Elias and Bram had a language of their own, a way of communicating that didn't always need words. But this felt different. This felt like something breaking. Finally, Elias sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I don't know, Bram. I'm figuring it out same as you, same as I've been figuring it out for the past 10 years. You brought her here," Bram said, nodding toward Mara. "That was your choice. I'm not saying it was the wrong one, but now we've got responsibilities we didn't have before. We can't just drift anymore. We can't just survive day to day." "I'm not drifting." "Then what are you doing?" Elias didn't answer. He just went back to his work, his jaw tight, his movements precise and controlled in the way they got when he was trying not to show emotion. Bram shook his head and stood, walking to the mouth of the cave. He stood there for a while, looking out at the valley, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, his shoulders tense. Mara could see the shape of him silhouetted against the fading light, solid and immovable. When he turned back, his voice was quieter. "I'm not trying to fight you," he said. "I just need to know we're not doing this for nothing, that there's something at the end besides just more of this." "We're doing it because it's the right thing," Elias said. "Because that girl would be dead, or worse, if we hadn't stepped in. That's enough for me. It has to be." "Is it enough for her?" Both men looked at Mara. She felt the weight of their eyes, the expectation behind the question. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure what to say. What could she say? That she was grateful? That she was terrified? That she had no idea what she was doing or where this was all going? "I don't know what I'm doing either," she admitted finally, her voice small in the cave's darkness. "I'm just trying not to die, trying not to go back to what I was." Bram's expression softened. "That's fair. But I do know one thing," Mara continued, finding strength as she spoke. "I'm not going back. Not to Coldwater Ridge. Not to any place like it. Not to any situation where I'm nothing and no one. I'd rather freeze up here. I'd rather starve than go back to being invisible." Elias nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted. "Then we'll make sure you don't freeze. We'll make sure you don't starve. We'll figure it out." The conversation ended there, But it left something heavy in the air, a question mark that hung over all of them. Mara lay awake that night, her bedroll spread on the cave floor, staring at the rough stone ceiling barely visible in the dying firelight. She could hear Elias keeping watch near the entrance, the soft sounds of Bram snoring from across the cave, and she thought about what came next, about what happened after survival, about whether there could ever be something more than just making it through another day. She didn't have an answer. 2 weeks later, the answer found them. Mara was checking the snares near the stream, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her movements automatic after weeks of practice. The morning was cold but clear, the kind of day where every sound seemed amplified. The rush of water over rocks, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the valley. That's when she heard it. Voices. Not animal sounds. Human voices. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the rifle, her pulse spiking. Slowly, carefully, she crept through the trees toward the sound, using the skills Bram had taught her, stepping on rocks instead of leaves, moving with the wind instead of against it, keeping her profile low. 2 people, no, 3, were making their way up the valley. A man, a woman, and a child, maybe 10 years old. They looked exhausted, their clothes torn and mud-stained, their faces gaunt with hunger and lack of sleep. The man was limping badly, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a tree branch. The woman carried the child on her back, her steps unsteady, her breathing labored. Even from a distance, Mara could see they were at the end of their strength. Her first instinct was to run back to the cave, to warn Elias and Bram, to let them handle it. That's what the old Mara would have done. Let someone else make the decisions, take the risks, be responsible. But she wasn't that person anymore. Hadn't been for months. She stepped out from the trees, her rifle held ready but not aimed. The man saw her first. He stopped, his hand going to a pistol tucked in his belt, but he didn't draw it. Just held his ground, swaying slightly on his injured leg, watching her with eyes that held more exhaustion than threat. "We don't want trouble," he said, his voice hoarse from days of shouting or crying or both. "Then you're in the right place," Mara replied, surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "What are you doing up here?" "Running." The woman shifted the child on her back, wincing as the movement pulled at muscles that were clearly past their limit. "Same as everyone else, I'd guess." "Running from what?" "Men. Bad ones. They burned our homestead 3 days south of here, killed our livestock, destroyed everything we'd built over 5 years. Told us if we didn't leave the territory, they'd do worse. They'd kill us. So we left." Mara's stomach tightened. She knew that story. Had lived a version of it herself. The details were different, but the shape was the same. Powerful people pushing out the powerless, taking what they wanted, destroying what they couldn't take. "How long have you been walking?" she asked. 5 days, maybe 6. Lost track somewhere after the second night. The child stirred, lifting her head from the woman's shoulder. She was pale, her skin waxy and damp, her eyes glassy with fever. Mara's chest constricted. She'd seen that look before, in the children who'd died on the wagon train west. Fever could kill faster than hunger or cold, and this child looked like she was already halfway gone. "Come with me," Mara said, making the decision without thinking about it. The man hesitated. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." "Because someone helped me once, when I needed it, when no one else would." She led them back to the cave, moving slowly so the man could keep up on his injured leg. When they came into view of the entrance, she saw Elias and Bram already there, standing with their rifles ready, having heard the voices and prepared for the worst. Elias's eyes moved from Mara to the strangers, taking in the injured man, the exhausted woman, the sick child. His expression didn't change, but Mara saw something shift behind his eyes. "They need help," Mara said simply. Elias looked at the family for a long moment, then at Mara, then nodded once. "Bring them in." They set the family up near the fire, the warmest spot in the cave. The woman, her name was Clara, collapsed as soon as she set the child down, her face crumpling with exhaustion and relief, and the sudden knowledge that she could stop, at least for a moment, stop carrying everything. The man, Thomas, sank onto a rock, His injured leg stretched out in front of him, revealing an ankle swollen to twice its normal size, mottled with purple and black bruises. The child, Annie, didn't move at all except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Bram examined her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he felt her forehead, checked her pulse, looked at her eyes. "She's burning up. Fever's bad." "I know," Clara said, her voice breaking with the weight of days of carrying that knowledge. "I've been trying to keep her cool, trying everything I know, but nothing's working. I don't know what else to do." "When did the fever start?" 3 days ago, just after we left the homestead. I thought it was just exhaustion at first, but it kept getting worse." Bram cursed under his breath, a low sound that spoke of experience with fever and knowledge of how quickly it could turn deadly. Could be infection. Could be something worse. Hard to tell without knowing what she was exposed to. "Can you help her?" Thomas asked, and his voice held the kind of desperation that comes from watching your child slip away and being powerless to stop it. "I can try. No promises, but I'll try." Bram worked through the night, and Mara helped. He brewed teas from herbs he kept carefully wrapped in his pack: willow bark for the fever, yarrow for infection, mint to settle the stomach. He wrapped Annie in wet cloths to bring down the temperature, changing them every few minutes as they grew warm from her burning skin. When the child thrashed and cried out, delirious with fever, Clara held her hands and Mara held her feet, keeping her from hurting herself. It was the longest night Mara had experienced since leaving Coldwater Ridge. Every hour felt like 10, every minute stretched into eternity. She watched Bram work with a focus and skill she'd never seen from him before, his rough exterior falling away to reveal someone who'd clearly done this before, who'd fought death and sometimes won. Thomas sat nearby, helpless, his face a mask of anguish as he watched his daughter fight for her life. Elias kept watch at the cave entrance, but Mara saw him glance back every few minutes, checking, witnessing. By morning, the fever had broken. Annie was still weak, her skin pale and damp, but her eyes were clearer. When Clara gave her water, she drank, actually swallowed instead of just letting it dribble down her chin. "Thank you," Clara said to Bram, her voice thick with emotion, with gratitude that had no adequate words. "I don't know how to repay you. We don't have anything, we lost everything, but I don't need repayment," Bram said gruffly, already turning away, uncomfortable with gratitude the way some men were uncomfortable with emotion. "Just keep her warm and make sure she eats. Small amounts at first. Broth if you can make it." Thomas looked at Elias, his expression complex, gratitude mixed with confusion, relief mixed with suspicion. "You didn't have to help us. You don't know us. We could be anyone." "No," Elias agreed, "but we did anyway." "Why?" Elias glanced at Mara, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. "Because someone has to, and because we know what it's like." The family stayed for 3 days, recovering their strength. Thomas's ankle was badly sprained, possibly fractured, and it needed time to heal. Clara was so exhausted that she could barely stand for the first 2 days, her body finally giving out now that she was somewhere safe. Annie improved slowly, eating small amounts, sleeping deeply, her color gradually returning. On the 3rd evening, as they all sat around the fire eating a dinner of roasted rabbit and wild onions that Clara had found growing near the stream, Thomas told them his story. He'd been a farmer, working a small plot of land about 30 miles east of Coldwater Ridge. "Good land," he said, with a reliable spring and soil that would grow almost anything if you worked it right. He'd built a cabin with his own hands, cleared fields, planted crops. For 3 years, they'd been building a life. Then a man named Samuel Pritchard had arrived. He owned the lumber mill in the nearest town and was buying up land in the valley, consolidating holdings, pushing out small farmers and homesteaders. He'd offered Thomas money for the land, not nearly what it was worth, but money nonetheless. Thomas had refused. "I should have known better," he said bitterly. "Should have known what would happen when you say no to men like that." Pritchard had come back a week later with different terms. Not an offer this time, but an ultimatum. Sell or face the consequences. Thomas had still refused. He'd worked too hard, built too much. It was his land, legally claimed and registered. Pritchard couldn't just take it, but he could burn it. They'd come at night, 6 men with torches and rifles. They'd burned the cabin, the barn, the crops in the field. They'd shot the cow and the chickens, slaughtered them for sport. and they'd left a message, carved into a post they'd left standing. Leave or die. I should have fought, Thomas said, his hands clenched into fists. Should have stood my ground, made them pay for what they did. You would have died, Elias said bluntly. And your family with you. 6 armed men against one farmer with a hunting rifle? That's not a fight, that's a massacre. Maybe, but at least I would have gone down fighting. At least I would have done something instead of just running. Fighting doesn't always mean standing still, Elias said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Sometimes it means knowing when to leave, knowing when the smart thing is to survive so you can fight another day. Is that what you did? Thomas asked, looking at Elias with new eyes. More or less. Thomas looked around the cave, at the rough walls, the meager supplies, the hard life these men had clearly chosen. And this is what you ended up with? This is what we built, Elias corrected, his voice firm. There's a difference. What we had before was taken from us. What we have now, we made ourselves. No one can take it because it doesn't exist on any deed or map. It exists because we say it does. Thomas nodded slowly, considering that. Then he looked at Elias with new intensity. You think there's room for more? For us? Elias looked at him sharply. What are you asking? I'm asking if we can stay. Not forever, maybe. Just long enough to figure out what comes next. Long enough to heal and plan and get strong again. I can work. I know farming, trapping, hunting. Clara knows medicine, plants, how to preserve food. We can contribute. We can pull our weight. Bram and Elias exchanged a glance, a whole conversation happening in that look. Mara held her breath, waiting. She realized suddenly that she wanted them to say yes. Wanted this family to stay. Not just because Annie reminded her of herself at that age, or because she felt sorry for them, but because something about their presence felt right, felt like the beginning of something. You can work? Elias asked, his voice careful. I can work. You can fight if it comes to it? If Pritchard or someone like him comes looking? Thomas's jaw set. If it comes to it, yeah, I can fight. I should have fought back there. I won't make that mistake again. Elias looked at Clara, who nodded firmly, her arm around Annie, then at the girl herself, who was watching them all with wide, serious eyes that seemed too old for her face, then back at Thomas. All right, he said, you can stay, but you pull your weight, no exceptions. Everyone works, everyone contributes, and if there's trouble, everyone fights. That's how we survive up here. Fair enough? And just like that, their camp of 3 became 6. Over the next few weeks, Thomas proved his worth. His ankle healed slowly, but even hobbling, he was useful. He knew how to set snares differently than Bram did, using techniques he'd learned from an old trapper back east. He knew how to work leather, how to preserve meat with salt and smoke so it would last through winter. He'd brought skills they didn't have, knowledge that made them all stronger. Clara was invaluable. She had a gift with plants that went beyond basic survival knowledge. She could identify dozens of species by sight and smell, knew which ones were edible and which ones would kill you, which ones could bring down fever and which ones could ease pain. She found wild herbs growing in protected spots around the valley that Bram had missed, expanded their medicinal supplies, taught Mara things she'd never known about the natural world. And Mara found herself teaching Annie. It started small, showing the girl how to build a proper fire, how to tie knots that would hold, how to tell direction by the sun and stars. But it grew into something more. Annie was hungry to learn, her eyes bright with curiosity, asking questions that sometimes stumped Mara and made her think harder about things she'd started taking for granted. Mara discovered that she liked teaching, liked seeing the girl's confidence grow with each new skill mastered, each small victory. It reminded her of her own journey, but with one crucial difference. Annie had people who cared about her, who would protect her, who would make sure she never felt invisible. One afternoon, as they practiced with the slingshot Bram had made for Annie, working on accuracy by aiming at a piece of bark propped against a tree, the girl asked, "Were you scared when you first came here?" Mara thought about it, remembering that first climb into the mountains, the terror and uncertainty. "Yeah, I was terrified." "Of what?" "Everything. The cold, the mountains. Elias and Bram. I didn't know them, didn't know if I could trust them, didn't know if I'd made a terrible mistake." "But you stayed." I didn't have anywhere else to go. Annie pulled back the slingshot, concentrating, then released. The stone flew wide, missing the bark by several feet. She frowned, disappointed in herself. Do you now? Have somewhere else you could go? Mara looked at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, if you could leave, would you? If someone came and said you could go back to a town, have a normal life, would you take it? Mara considered it. A few months ago, the answer would have been yes without hesitation. She'd hated the mountains, the cold, the constant struggle. But now, looking around the valley, at the cave they'd built, at the people who'd become something like family, she wasn't sure. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe not. This place, it's hard. It's harder than anything I've ever done. But it's also mine, ours. Nobody can take it from us. Nobody can tell us to leave or that we don't belong. That's worth something. Annie smiled, a bright, genuine expression that transformed her thin face. Good. I like having you here. You're teaching me how to be strong. Something warm bloomed in Mara's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She ruffled the girl's hair affectionately. You're already strong. You're just learning how to use it. But the peace didn't last. It was early summer when the rider came. The valley had transformed, wild flowers blooming in the meadow near the stream, the harsh gray of winter replaced by green and gold. They'd relaxed slightly, believing they'd climbed high enough and hidden well enough that no one would find them. They were wrong. A single man on a tired horse, picking his way up the valley like he knew exactly where he was going, like he'd been given directions. Elias spotted him first from his watch position and immediately called everyone to the cave, his voice sharp with urgency. Who is it? Mara asked, her rifle already in her hands, her heart rate spiking. Don't know, but he's alone, which means he's either stupid or confident. Neither one is good. They watched from concealed positions as the rider approached. When he got close enough, Elias stepped out, his rifle leveled at the man's chest. That's far enough, he called. The rider stopped, pulling his horse to a halt. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen hard years but survived them through cunning rather than strength. He raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed, or at least that his hands were empty. My name's Samuel Pritchard, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. I'm looking for the Hendricks family, Thomas and Clara. I believe they came this way. Mara's blood ran cold. Pritchard, the name that had haunted Thomas's story, that represented everything they were running from. You've got the wrong valley, Elias said flatly. I don't think I do. I tracked them here, followed their trail for 6 days. I know they're here, and I know you're hiding them. You tracked wrong. Turn around and go back down. I can't do that. I need to speak with Thomas. I've come to make things right. You mean the same way you made things right when you burned his farm? Thomas stepped into view, his voice hard. When you killed his livestock? When you threatened his family? Pritchard looked at him, his expression unreadable. I gave you a fair price for that land, Thomas. You gave me half what the land was worth and threatened to kill my family if I didn't take it. That's not fair. That's extortion. Business is business. The valley's growing. Progress can't wait for sentiment. Then you can take your business and get the hell out of here, Bram said, appearing beside Elias, his own rifle ready. Pritchard's eyes swept over the group. Elias, Bram, Mara, Thomas, Clara standing protectively in front of Annie. He seemed to be weighing something, calculating odds and angles. I didn't come here to fight, he said finally, his tone shifting to something more reasonable. I came to make things right, to offer a solution that benefits everyone. Little late for that, Thomas said. Maybe, but hear me out. Pritchard dismounted slowly, carefully, keeping his hands visible. His horse was loaded with packs, supplies, things that suggested he'd come prepared for a long journey. I made a mistake. I admit that. I let my men get out of hand. I shouldn't have let them burn your place. That was wrong, and I take responsibility for it. That's supposed to make it better? Clara asked, her voice sharp with anger. No, but I'm willing to make it right. I'll pay you what the land was actually worth. Hell, I'll pay double, 3 times what it's worth. All I ask is that you come back down, sign over the deed properly, and let me build what I'm trying to build. So you can do the same thing to the next person, Clara pressed, So you can keep pushing people out until you own everything? So I can build something, Pritchard said, and there was genuine passion in his voice now. A real town, with schools and stores and a future, with law and order and civilization. But I need land to do it. I need your land specifically because it controls the water rights for the whole valley. Without it, I can't build what needs to be built. And if we say no? Thomas asked. Pritchard's expression hardened, the reasonable mask slipping just slightly. Then I'll find another way. I always do. That sounds like a threat, Elias observed. It's not a threat. It's a fact. I've got resources. Men, money, time. I can wait you out or I can force the issue. The choice is yours, but the outcome is the same. I'm building that town whether you cooperate or not. We've held out this long, Bram said, against Vern Tully and his drunken friends. I'm not Vern Tully. I'm a businessman with a plan and the means to execute it. You can't hold out against that. Not up here, not forever. Elias and Pritchard stared at each other, the tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Mara's finger hovered near the trigger of her rifle, her heart pounding. This was different from Vern and his men. This was someone with real power, real resources, someone who could make good on his threats. Then Mara stepped forward, moving between Elias and Pritchard, surprising everyone, including herself. You're right, she said. You're not Vern Tully. Pritchard looked at her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place her face. I know you. You worked for my sister, Margaret Pritchard, the boarding house in Coldwater Ridge. Your sister threw me out because Vern told her to. And you know what? I'm glad she did. Because that night, I learned something important. What's that? I learned that people like you, people who think money and power make them untouchable, who think they can push everyone else around because they've got resources, you're not as strong as you think you are. Pritchard's expression darkened. Is that so? Yeah, because you need us more than we need you. You need workers to build your town. You need land. You need people to buy into whatever vision you're selling. You need cooperation. But we don't need anything from you. We've got everything we need right here, water, shelter, each other. You can't buy that. You can't threaten that away. You think hiding in the mountains makes you free? Pritchard asked, and there was something almost pitying in his voice. You're just running, same as everyone else who can't make it in the real world. You're hiding because you're weak. Maybe, Mara said, but at least we're running together. At least we're not alone, and we're not destroying other people to get what we want. For a long moment, Pritchard didn't respond. He looked at Thomas. Is that your answer too? You're going to let this girl speak for you? Thomas glanced at Clara, then at Annie peeking out from behind her mother's skirts, then back at Pritchard. When he spoke, his voice was firm. She's not speaking for me. She's speaking with me. And yeah, that's our answer. We're staying here. You can't have the land. Find another way to build your town. Pritchard's jaw tightened with frustration and something that might have been genuine disappointment. You're making a mistake. A serious one. You won't last the winter up here. This elevation, this exposure. Come January, you'll be begging to come down. And when you do, don't expect me to offer you anything. This is your last chance. We'll take our chances, Elias said. Pritchard mounted his horse, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression calculating, memorizing faces. This isn't over. You understand that? I'm building that town with or without you, and anyone who stands in my way will be removed, legally if possible, otherwise if necessary. We understand, Mara said, and we're still saying no. Pritchard yanked his horse's reins, turning it roughly. See you in the spring, if you survive that long. He rode off without another word, disappearing down the valley the way he'd come. When he was gone, the group stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them like fresh snow. That's it then, Bram said quietly. We're committed now. He knows where we are. He knows we're not leaving. We were always committed, Elias replied. We just made it official. Thomas looked at Mara, his expression complex. Gratitude mixed with fear, mixed with something that might have been respect. You didn't have to do that. Speak up like that. You could have stayed quiet. Let us handle it. Yeah, I did have to, Mara said, because I'm done being quiet, done being invisible, done letting people like him decide what happens to people like us. Clara put a hand on Mara's shoulder, squeezing gently. Thank you. That night, they sat around the fire longer than usual, no one quite ready to sleep. The confrontation with Pritchard had changed something, crystallized something that had been forming for weeks. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were choosing this place, this life, each other. He'll come back, Bram said eventually. Maybe not this year, but eventually. Men like that don't give up. Let him come, Elias said. We'll be ready. Will we? Thomas asked. He wasn't lying about resources. If he brings enough men, enough guns, then we fight, Mara said. Or we move deeper into the mountains. Or we find another way. But we don't go back. Never back. Annie, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. Why does he want to build a town so bad? If it's going to hurt people? It was Clara who answered. Because some people think building something big is more important than protecting the people who are already there. They think progress justifies any cost. That's stupid, Annie said with the blunt honesty of childhood. Yeah, Mara agreed. It is. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. Word spread. Quietly, carefully, through the network of trappers and traders who move through the mountains like ghosts, carrying news and rumors from settlement to settlement. Word spread about the valley, where people could go if they needed to disappear, where people who'd been pushed out or burned out or beaten down could find shelter. Others came. First, it was just one, a trapper named Jake, who'd lost his license to a corrupt official and been blacklisted from working in the territory. He was older, skilled, and he knew the mountains like most people knew their own homes. He brought knowledge about tracking, about reading animal signs, about predicting weather. Then came a widow named Margaret, who'd been cheated out of her land by a crooked lawyer. She brought seeds, real garden seeds she'd kept hidden through her journey, and knowledge about farming at high altitude that none of them had. A young couple arrived, barely 20, who'd fled an arranged marriage Margaret's family had tried to force on her. They didn't have much in terms of skills yet, but they had strong backs and willing hearts. They didn't all stay. Some came, rested for a few weeks, then moved on, looking for something easier, something more civilized. But others stayed. And with each person who stayed, the camp grew stronger, more capable, more resilient. They built more shelters, crude but effective, scattered around the valley in positions that could be defended if needed. They expanded the garden Clara and Margaret started, terracing the slope near the stream to create flat growing areas for vegetables. They set up better defenses, lookout positions, early warning systems, cached weapons and supplies in multiple locations in case they had to scatter and regroup. Elias and Bram trained everyone who was willing in basic survival and self-defense. They taught people how to shoot, how to move quietly, how to think tactically. It wasn't about creating soldiers. It was about making sure everyone had the skills to survive if things went bad. And Mara found herself in an unexpected role. She became the person who welcomed newcomers, who listened to their stories, who helped them find their place in the growing community. Not because anyone appointed her or because she sought the position, but because people naturally came to her. Maybe because she remembered what it felt like to arrive desperate and afraid. Maybe because she listened without judgment. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, personality conflicts, days when it felt like everything was falling apart. They had to figure out how to share limited resources, how to make decisions that affected everyone, how to deal with people who didn't pull their weight or who caused problems. One night, about 4 months after Thomas and his family had arrived, Mara sat with Elias near the stream, both of them taking a break from the constant demands of the growing camp. The sun was setting behind the western peak, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. You ever think about going back, she asked, to wherever you came from before all this? Elias was quiet for a while, watching the water flow past. To where? Anywhere. A real town. A real life, somewhere with stores and schools and people who aren't running from something. This is a real life, Elias said finally. You know what I mean? I do. And no, I don't think about it. That world, it doesn't have a place for people like me anymore. Like us. We made too many choices that put us outside the lines they draw. This is where I belong now, where we all belong. Mara looked around the valley, at the small cluster of shelters barely visible in the fading light, at the thin columns of smoke rising from cook fires, at the sound of Annie's laughter echoing off the rocks, as she played with the other children who'd arrived. "What are we building here?" she asked. "Really?" "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "Something new, something that doesn't exist anywhere else. A place where the rules are ours, where no one can tell us we don't belong. That's not sustainable. Eventually, we'll need things we can't make ourselves: medicine, tools, supplies. Then we'll trade for them. Carefully, selectively, but on our terms." Mara nodded slowly, thinking. "And if Pritchard comes back? If he brings real force? Then we deal with it, together. That's the point of this place. No one stands alone anymore." The final test came in winter. It was brutal, even worse than the previous year. The valley disappeared under 6 feet of snow, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in metal canteens. The wind howled through the mountains like something alive and angry, and there were days when stepping outside meant risking frostbite within minutes. Their supplies ran low faster than expected. More people meant more mouths to feed, and they hadn't had enough time to stockpile adequately. People got sick. Influenza swept through the camp, laying out a third of them at one point. There were nights when Mara wasn't sure they'd make it to morning, when it seemed like the mountains were finally going to win. But they didn't. They rationed food until every meal was barely enough to keep hunger at bay. They shared warmth, packing into shelters meant for half as many people, using body heat to survive when firewood ran dangerously low. They looked out for each other. The healthy cared for the sick, the strong helped the weak, and nobody was left behind. Jake, the old trapper, taught them how to ice fish through holes in the frozen stream, providing protein when game was scarce. Margaret showed them how to make soup from pine needles that prevented scurvy. Thomas rigged a primitive still that could melt snow faster than they could by fire alone, conserving precious fuel. And slowly, impossibly, they survived. When spring finally came, when the snow began to melt and the valley came back to life, they were still there. Thinner, harder, marked by the experience, but alive. All of them. It was late spring, almost summer, when the strangers arrived. Not men with guns this time, but families. 6 groups traveling together, some with wagons, others on foot. They'd heard rumors, they said, of a place in the mountains where people could live free, where you didn't need money or connections or permission, just willingness to work and contribute. They came from different backgrounds. Farmers pushed off their land, workers fired from mills for organizing, families fleeing debt or the law or situations they wouldn't fully explain. They were desperate and hopeful and skeptical all at once. Elias met them at the valley entrance, his rifle slung over his shoulder but visible, his expression cautious but not hostile. "This isn't a town," he said, his voice carrying to all of them. "We don't have laws or courts or official anything. We just have rules. You work. You contribute what you can. You look out for each other. You don't steal, don't hurt people, don't take more than your share. If you can't live with that, you can't stay here." The leader of the group, a man named Daniel, nodded. "That's all we're asking for. A chance to work. A chance to build something. A place where our kids can grow up without being ground down." Elias looked back at the camp, at Mara standing near the cook fire, at Bram working on a new shelter, at all the people who'd come here looking for the same thing. Then he looked at Daniel. "All right," he said, "you've got your chance. But understand, this place only works if everyone commits to it, if everyone's willing to put the community ahead of themselves sometimes. You can do that?" "We can." The camp continued to grow. By the end of summer, there were 23 people living in the valley. By winter, 32. They built a communal hall using techniques Thomas and some of the newer arrivals knew, a structure large enough to gather everyone under one roof for meetings and meals. They built a smokehouse for preserving meat. They established a real school where the children, there were 7 now, could learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and the practical skills they'd need to survive. They established trade routes with other remote settlements carefully, always maintaining secrecy about the valley's exact location. They traded furs and medicinal herbs and the fine leather goods Thomas had become expert at making for tools they couldn't forge themselves, for seeds and medicine and the occasional luxury like coffee or sugar. And Mara, who'd once been invisible, became central to it all. Not because she was in charge. They didn't have leaders in the traditional sense, just people who were good at different things and took responsibility for those areas. But because she listened, because she remembered what it felt like to have nothing and to be no one. Because she made sure that everyone who came to the valley, no matter how broken or desperate, was seen, was heard, mattered. She'd become the person she'd needed when she first stumbled out of Coldwater Ridge. One afternoon in late autumn, almost 2 years after she'd first arrived in the mountains, Mara was teaching a group of children their letters when a young woman appeared at the edge of the clearing. She was thin, dirty, her eyes wide with a fear that Mara recognized immediately in her bones. Mara set down her chalk and walked over, the children's voices fading behind her. "You safe?" Mara asked gently. The woman nodded, though her hands were shaking and her eyes kept darting around like she expected someone to jump out at any moment. "You got people looking for you?" A pause. Then another nod, this one almost imperceptible. Mara looked at Elias, who was nearby repairing a fence. He nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. Then she turned back to the woman. "You're safe here," Mara said, her voice firm and sure. "No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to make you leave. No one's going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. You understand?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Mara thought back to that frozen alley in Coldwater Ridge, to the moment Elias had stepped out of the darkness, to every choice she'd made since then, every step that had led her here, every person who'd helped her become someone new. "Because someone helped me once," she said, "when I needed it most, when I had nothing and no one, and it changed everything. So now I help other people. We all do. That's how this works." The woman stayed. Her name was Rebecca, and her story was different from Mara's in the details, but the same in the shape. A man who thought he owned her, a system that wouldn't protect her, a desperate flight into the wilderness looking for anything better than what she was leaving behind. And she wasn't the last. More came as word continued to spread through the invisible networks of the displaced and desperate. The valley became known, in whispers, as a place where the lost could be found, where the broken could be made whole, where no one was invisible. They didn't save everyone. Some people arrived too damaged, too sick, too far gone. Some couldn't adapt to the harshness of mountain life, couldn't handle the isolation or the constant struggle. Some left after a few weeks or months, seeking something easier, something more familiar. But many stayed. And those who stayed built something remarkable. Years passed. The settlement evolved, becoming more organized while maintaining its essential character. A place without traditional hierarchy, where decisions were made communally and everyone's voice mattered. They developed systems for conflict resolution, for resource allocation, for teaching skills and sharing knowledge. Children grew up knowing they mattered, that their voices counted, that they could become anything their abilities and effort could achieve. Women had the same rights and responsibilities as men. No one was valued based on wealth or family name or connections, just on what they contributed and who they chose to be. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still problems, still days when Mara wondered if they could keep it going. But it was theirs, built by people who'd been told they were nothing, who'd proven everyone wrong. And Mara, who'd once been the girl no one saw, became the woman everyone knew. Not because she sought attention or power, but because she'd made sure no one else would ever feel invisible again. She never went back to Coldwater Ridge, never even thought about it except as a reference point, the place she'd been before, the life she'd left behind. Because she'd learned the most important thing Elias had tried to teach her from that first day. You can't change where you came from, but you can choose where you go. You can choose who you become. And sometimes, the only way to be truly free is to build your own kind of freedom, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time. In the harsh silence of the mountains, in a valley that didn't appear on any map, Mara Vance had become undeniable. And in doing so, she'd made sure no one else would ever be invisible again. The mountains had taken a broken girl and forged her into something new, something strong, something that mattered. And that, in the end, was everything.